On a cold night, a man crawled into the street, beaten and bleeding, babbling that he'd crossed the wrong woman. Her real name was Stephanie St. Clair. She wasn't Italian, she wasn't Irish, and she wasn't anyone's wife in the shadows. She was a black immigrant woman running Harlem's most lucrative racket, and she had just declared war on the Mafia. To understand her war, you have to understand Harlem. In the 1920s and early 30s, it wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a capital of Black America. Tens of thousands of families fled the racial violence of the South during the Great Migration and settled in this dense, electric corner of Manhattan. By day, the streets bustled with barbershops, cafes, and storefront churches. By night, Harlem transformed. Jazz poured out of smoky clubs like the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom. Langston Hughes wrote his poetry. Duke Ellington played his trumpet. The Harlem Renaissance was at its peak, a cultural explosion, unlike anything America had seen. But below the music and art, another economy thrived. Rent was high, jobs were scarce, banks refused loans to black families. So Harlem built its own system of hope and money, the numbers game. The numbers game was Harlem's lottery, long before the government made it legal. Here's how it worked. You picked a 3-digit number, placed a small bet with a neighborhood collector, maybe a nickel, maybe a dime, and waited for the daily draw, often based on something printed in the newspapers like stock market figures or racetrack betting totals. The payout could be huge, $50 for a nickel bet, hundreds for a dime, for a working-class family scraping by on low wages. That kind of windfall meant rent paid, groceries stocked, or a dream briefly made real. And for the bankers who ran the game, it was a gold mine. Millions of nickels and dimes poured through Harlem every week. It was a cash river, untaxed, unregulated, irresistible. This is where Stephanie St. Clair stepped in. Born in 1886 in Guadeloupe, a French Caribbean colony, St. Clair arrived in New York in her 20s. She had little money, no famous name, and a thick French accent. But she had something more important: cunning, charisma, and absolute refusal to be dismissed. She started small. Reports say she was literate in both French and English and helped fellow Caribbean immigrants write letters and read documents. Then she found her way into the numbers racket. By the mid-1920s, she wasn't just another banker. She was the banker. St. Clair's organization stretched across Harlem. She dressed impeccably, spoke with authority, and carried herself like royalty. And Harlem loved her for it. Unlike outsiders, she reinvested her wealth in the community. She posted bail for black residents harassed by racist cops. She loaned money when banks slammed their doors. She funded schools and businesses. To Harlem, she wasn't just a criminal. She was a protector, a benefactor, a queen. But power never goes uncontested. Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, was a Bronx bootlegger who made his fortune in beer and liquor during Prohibition. Schultz was ruthless, paranoid, and always hungry for more. When alcohol profits began shrinking, he looked to Harlem. The numbers racket was fat and ripe. To Schultz, Harlem wasn't a community. It was territory to conquer. And he expected St. Clair to fold like everyone else. He was wrong. Schultz's men began the usual way: intimidation. Collectors working for St. Clair were threatened, beaten, sometimes killed. Harlem bookies were told to switch their allegiance or face consequences. But Stephanie St. Clair didn't surrender. She fought. Her enforcers struck back, beating Schultz's thugs, running them off corners, making examples of anyone foolish enough to cross her directly. Rival gangsters ended up stabbed, shot, or dumped in alleys. Harlem was used to gangsters fighting each other, but never had they seen a woman at the center of the storm. And then came her boldest move: the press. St. Clair took out full-page ads in Harlem newspapers like the Amsterdam News. In them, she warned Harlem citizens not to be tricked by Schultz's men. She named crooked cops who took mob bribes, exposing them in print. She mocked Schultz himself, calling him an invader and a bully. It was unprecedented. Gangsters fought in the shadows. She fought in daylight with headlines as her weapons. By her side in these years was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Younger, streetwise, quick with his fists, Bumpy became her right-hand man. Where she had strategy and charisma, he brought muscle and presence. Together, they made Harlem a fortress. Schultz's expansion stalled. And in 1935, Schultz himself was gunned down, not by St. Clair, but by the Mafia's ruling commission, which had grown tired of his recklessness. But ask Harlem who stood tallest in that war, and the answer wasn't Luciano or the commission. It was Stephanie St. Clair, the woman who refused to bow. St. Clair wasn't just feared, she was admired. She walked Harlem in furs and jewels, fluent in French and English, carrying herself like she owned the avenue. But beyond style, she had a voice. She wrote letters, published statements, and openly demanded civil rights for Harlem's black citizens. She attacked police brutality long before it was a national conversation. She wasn't afraid to challenge white power structures, gangsters, politicians, or police, and she didn't care who tried to shut her up. This is where the contrast matters. Mae Capone, Al's wife, is remembered because of who she married. She was photographed, quoted, mythologized as the loyal wife of America's most famous gangster, Stephanie St. Clair. She married once or twice, but her fame didn't come from a man. It came from her own empire. Yet history barely records her name. One woman endured in silence and became a legend's footnote. The other roared in her own right and was nearly erased. After Schultz's death, Bumpy Johnson became Harlem's top crime boss, but he never forgot his mentor. St. Clair, now older, stepped back from active leadership but remained a presence in Harlem. In later years, she married, divorced, and lived more quietly. She survived arrests, court battles, and decades of change. By the time she died in 1969, the Mafia had shifted, Harlem had changed, and her name had faded from popular memory. But for those who knew, she remained unforgettable. Why did the world forget? The reasons are bitter but clear. She was a woman in a man's world. Gangster stories are written about Al, Lucky Dutch, not about women who ran the game themselves. She was black in an America that dismissed black power. White newspapers caricatured her as exotic, angry, unfeminine, anything but a leader. And she didn't leave a myth. Capone went to prison. Luciano went to exile. Schultz died in a blaze of bullets. St. Clair lived, quietly. And history forgets quiet endings. History crowns its kings and carves their names into stone. Capone, Luciano, Schultz. The world chants them like saints in a crooked litany. But Stephanie St. Clair, she built her own kingdom, wrote her own rules, and fought a war she wasn't supposed to win. She was a queen who stared down the mob and told them no. The books forgot her. Harlem didn't. And maybe that's enough. The records fade, the headlines rot, the kings turn to dust. But in the alleys and avenues where she once walked, the story still lingers. A woman in furs, chin high, daring anyone to test her. Queenie doesn't bend. Queenie doesn't bow.